As night settles gently over Pine Hollow Cabin, the world grows quieter and still. The last light fades from the snow-covered trees. Doors are closed, and the fire at the center of the room burns low and steady. Nothing dramatic happens here. This is a quiet story of ordinary people sharing warmth, familiar routines, and the comfort of knowing the night will pass. We will move slowly through one winter night, listening to soft sounds and unhurried moments. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Simply allow the day to loosen its hold and let the night settle naturally around you. Then, at your own pace, allow the story to drift onward and carry you gently towards sleep. The Appalachian Mountains were already quiet when the sun began to sink. Not suddenly, but with a kind of patience. Light thinning across the ridges, shadows stretching longer between the trees. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, each flake soft and dry, settling into the forest as though it had always belonged there. The town below, little more than a scattering of wooden buildings and darkened windows, faded early into stillness. Winter had arrived not with force, but with certainty. The Miller family's cabin sat just beyond the town's edge, where the road narrowed and the forest thickened. It was a large log cabin, built low to the ground, its walls darkened by years of smoke and weather. As evening approached, the final chores of the day were finished without hurry. The heavy wooden door was closed, not to shut out the night, but to hold on to what little warmth remained inside. Inside the cabin, the air was calm. Sarah Miller moved slowly across the room, her steps quiet against the worn wooden floor. She was a woman in her late 30s, tall and slender, with a posture shaped by years of steady work rather than strain. Her dark hair was braided simply and pinned back, streaked with early threads of grey. She no longer bothered to hide. There was a softness to her movements, a careful way she handled objects and people alike, as though she had learned long ago that gentleness was not weakness, but preservation. Sarah had not always been this way. Years earlier, before the winters grew harsher and the losses more frequent, she had been quicker to speak, quicker to worry. But a season of illness, one that nearly took her youngest child, had changed something in her. Since then, she carried herself with a quiet patience, attentive but unhurried, as if she understood that panic wasted energy better spent elsewhere. She paused near the small window, drawing the thick curtain closed. Outside, snow pressed softly against the glass. Inside, the light dimmed further, and the room grew smaller in a comforting way. Near the hearth, Margaret Miller knelt carefully on one knee. Margaret was the oldest in the house, well into her 70s, her back slightly curved but her hands still steady. Her hair, once dark, was now fully white, worn loose down her shoulders. Her face was deeply lined, not with bitterness, but with years of watching. Children grow, seasons pass, and hardships arrive without announcement. She spoke little these days, but when she did, people listened. Margaret did not look up as she stirred the fire. She added a single piece of wood, then adjusted the embers with deliberate care. The fire was not meant to blaze. It was meant to last. This was something she had learned as a girl, and something she passed down without words. Across the room, Ethan Miller stood quietly near the wall, his boots dangling slightly off the floor as he sat on a low bench. Ethan was 9 years old, thin and long-limbed, with hair the colour of dried wheat and eyes that missed very little. He had always been observant, the sort of child who noticed changes before he understood them. This winter felt different to him. He could not explain why, only that the cold seemed heavier, the daylight shorter than he remembered. Last year, he had still been able to play outside until supper. This year, darkness arrived before he was ready for it. As he watched his grandmother tend the fire, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but awareness, the quiet kind. He rubbed his hands together slowly, then held them toward the warmth. Thomas Miller entered from the back of the cabin, brushing snow from his coat before hanging it on a wooden peg. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, tall and solid, his frame shaped by years of chopping wood and hauling supplies through rough terrain. His beard was thick and dark, already dusted with grey, though his face often appeared stern at rest. There was a steadiness to him that the others relied on without question. Thomas did not speak when he entered. He only nodded once to Sarah, then moved closer to the hearth, extending his hands briefly toward the fire. His movements were economical, never rushed, never wasted. Behind him padded Old Bear, the family's dog. Old Bear was a large, aging mutt with a heavy chest and fur that had faded from black to salt and pepper. His muzzle was white, his ears permanently relaxed. He had been with the family longer than Ethan could remember, and moved now with the careful dignity of an animal that knew its place and its purpose. He circled once near the fire, then lay down with a soft sigh, his back to the heat. A grey cat, Willow, appeared briefly from beneath a table, her tail flicking once, before she settled near Old Bear's side. She was small and alert, her green eyes half closed, content to borrow warmth without demanding attention. No one commented on the animals. Their presence was as expected as the fire itself. As the cabin darkened, the family's movements grew fewer. Sarah checked the shelves where blankets were folded, adjusting a stack that leaned slightly. Thomas secured the door latch with a practiced motion. Margaret finished tending the fire and settled into a chair closest to the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Ethan slid off the bench and moved closer to his grandmother, sitting cross-legged on the floor. He did not speak, but Margaret rested her hand briefly on his shoulder. A small gesture, grounding and familiar. Outside, the wind rose gently, brushing snow against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled softly, then settled again. This was how winter began. Not with danger, not with drama, but with doors closing, light fading, and people drawing nearer without being told to do so. The Millers did not believe they could defeat the season. They did not try. They only prepared to move through it, one night at a time. Ethan watched the fire until his eyelids grew heavy. He did not know what this winter would bring. He only knew that it felt different, and that everyone else seemed to know it too. Margaret added no more wood. The fire held, and the night, for now, remained quiet. The cabin held the night in a way the forest could not. Outside, snow continued to fall in steady silence, piling softly against the lower logs and settling into the narrow spaces between roots and stone. Wind moved through the trees with a low, distant sound, but by the time it reached the cabin walls, it had already lost its sharpness. The structure was low and solid, built generations earlier, with an understanding that winter was not something to challenge, only something to endure. Thick logs were stacked carefully, their rounded edges fitted close, sealed with moss and clay that had darkened with age. Each seam held not only warmth, but the familiar scent of smoke that had soaked into the wood over countless cold seasons. Inside, the air was warmer near the center of the room and cooler along the walls, but never biting. The fire's presence lingered even when it burned low, its heat absorbed by the heavy timbers and released slowly, as if the cabin itself had learned to breathe. This was not a place designed for comfort in the modern sense. It was designed for survival, and over time, survival had taken on the quiet shape of familiarity. Sarah Miller moved from one side of the room to the other, checking the bedding laid out along the far wall. She lifted the corner of a thick wool blanket, then smoothed it back into place. The blankets were heavy, woven tightly by hand years ago, their fibers slightly rough, but dependable. Beneath them lay animal skins, carefully cleaned and mended, their fur worn thin in places where bodies had rested winter after winter. Sarah's hands moved with practiced ease. She had learned these motions early, first watching her own mother, then repeating them until they became instinct. Sarah was careful with everything she touched, not because she feared breaking it, but because she understood how easily comfort could be lost. Years ago, when illness had swept through the valley and supplies had run thin, she had learned that preparation was not an act of worry, but of care. Since then, she trusted routine more than reassurance. Checking the blankets was not something she questioned. It was simply part of keeping everyone safe through the night. At the hearth, Lily Miller knelt on the worn stone floor, her small hands wrapped around a single piece of firewood. Lily was 6 years old, slight and quick, with dark curls that refused to stay tied back, and eyes that reflected curiosity more than caution. She had grown up beside this fire, watching it flicker and settle, but only recently had she been allowed to take part in its tending. Tonight, she leaned forward carefully and placed the wood beside the embers, rather than directly on them, just as she had been taught. She did not rush. Lily understood, in her own way, that fire responded poorly to impatience. The wood caught slowly, releasing a faint crackle and a brief, sharp scent of sap. Lily watched closely, her head tilted slightly, as she observed how the flame changed shape, how it accepted the offering, and then settled back into a steady glow. She smiled, not broadly, but with quiet satisfaction. This was something she could do, something that mattered. Old Bear lifted his head briefly at the sound, then lowered it again, shifting his heavy body closer to the warmth. His breathing was slow and deep, the rise and fall of his chest steady. The dog had once been restless, always alert to sounds outside. But age had softened him. Now he trusted the cabin to hold, trusted the people around him to notice what needed noticing. Willow, the grey cat, stretched once, then curled tighter, her tail tucked neatly over her nose. Sarah glanced toward Lily and nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Lily straightened slightly, proud but calm, then moved back toward her place near the wall. She did not linger by the fire. Part of learning to tend it was knowing when to step away. Near the back of the cabin, Thomas Miller adjusted a wooden shutter that covered a narrow window. He pressed it firmly into place, checking the latch twice. The cabin had few openings, and each one was treated with respect. A loose shutter could let in more than cold. It could bring dampness, drafts, and restlessness. Satisfied, Thomas stepped back, his boots leaving faint traces of snow melt on the floor that would dry by morning. Ethan watched these movements quietly. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, pulling his knees close to his chest beneath a blanket that was already warming. The cabin felt different now that the night had fully settled. The outside world seemed farther away, less important. Ethan found himself listening, not for distant sounds, but for the familiar ones inside. The shifting of wood as it expanded with heat, the soft rasp of the fire, the occasional movement of old Bear's paws against the floor. Margaret remained near the hearth, her eyes half closed, as if she were listening to something deeper than sound. She had seen many winters begin this way. To her, the early darkness and the thickening snow were not warnings, but signals. They told her it was time to turn inward, to conserve, to repeat the patterns that had carried her family through before. She reached down and adjusted the iron poker slightly, nudging a coal back into place. The fire responded with a brief glow, then quieted again. The smell of smoke lingered gently in the air, mixed with wool, wood, and something faintly sweet from the drying herbs hung near the rafters. It was a smell Ethan associated with safety, though he had never named it as such. Now, sitting there, he realized how deeply it was woven into his sense of home. No one spoke much. Words were unnecessary. Each person knew their role, not because it had been assigned, but because it had been lived into over time. Sarah finished her checks and sat down near Lily, wrapping an arm lightly around her shoulders. Lily leaned into her without comment, already growing drowsy. The cabin settled further as the night deepened. Heat gathered where people gathered. Cold remained outside, pressing gently but persistently against the walls. Inside, the seams held. The fire held. The blankets waited. This was the cabin's purpose. Not to make winter disappear, but to make it bearable. To take the edge off the cold and replace it with something slower, softer, and human. Ethan lay back at last, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. He thought again of how this winter felt different, but the thought no longer troubled him. The cabin felt ready. The people felt ready. That, he sensed, was enough for now. The fire burned low and steady. The wood held its warmth, and the night remained outside. The fire did not demand attention. It rested at the center of the cabin, as it always had, low and steady, its flames small enough that they barely rose above the stone ring that held them. There was no roar, no dramatic flare of light. Instead, there was a quiet persistence, a soft glow that reached outward and touched everything gently. The fire was not there to challenge the winter pressing against the walls. It existed only to remind the people gathered around it that warmth, once established, could be protected. Thomas Miller stood closest to the hearth, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the floor. In the dim light, the lines of his face looked deeper, shaped by years of labor and long seasons endured rather than conquered. Thomas was not a man given to explanations, but when it came to the fire, he slowed his movements even more than usual. He crouched down beside the embers, resting his weight on the balls of his feet, and gestured for Ethan to come closer. Ethan hesitated only a moment before sliding off the sleeping platform and kneeling beside his father. From this angle, the fire looked different, less like a thing to watch, more like something alive, breathing quietly. Ethan could feel the heat against his cheeks, not intense, but steady and reassuring. He noticed how the stones around the hearth were warm to the touch, how they seemed to hold on to the fire's presence, even where flames did not reach. "This is how you help it last," Thomas said, his voice low so it would not disturb the calm of the room. He used a short iron tool to draw a layer of ash gently over the glowing coals, not smothering them, but covering them just enough. You don't feed it too much. You don't leave it exposed. Ethan watched closely, his eyes tracking every movement. Thomas worked slowly, explaining little, trusting that observation would teach more than words. He showed Ethan how to recognize the difference between a coal that still held life and one that had gone cold. The living coals glowed faintly beneath their grey covering, like distant stars hidden behind cloud. "When morning comes," Thomas continued, "these will still be here. You give them air again, and the fire remembers." Ethan nodded, though he did not fully understand yet. What he understood was the care in his father's hands, the way Thomas treated the fire, not as a tool, but as something that responded to respect. It made Ethan feel older, included in something important. Behind them, Sarah watched quietly. She sat near Lily, her arm resting loosely around the girl's shoulders. Sarah's face was calm, but her attention was sharp. She noticed how Thomas adjusted the ash, how Ethan leaned forward without touching, how the fire responded by settling into a deeper glow. This scene was familiar to her. She had learned the same lesson as a child, at her own father's side, during winters when food was scarce and nights were long. Those winters had shaped her more than she often admitted. They had taught her restraint, patience, and the value of continuity. Since then, she had come to believe that survival was less about strength and more about remembering what worked and repeating it faithfully. Lily watched from beside her mother, her dark eyes wide with quiet interest. She was too young to tend the fire overnight, but she listened all the same. She noticed how the flames seemed calmer once Thomas finished, how the crackling softened into something almost like a whisper. Lily associated that sound with safety. She leaned her head against Sarah's arm and sighed, already drifting towards sleep. Margaret remained in her chair near the hearth, her gaze fixed on the fire with a familiarity that went beyond habit. She had seen this same exchange many times. Fathers teaching sons, hands passing knowledge along without ceremony. To her, the fire was not just warmth, it was memory. It carried the marks of every night it had been banked carefully. Every morning it had been coaxed back to life. She spoke at last, her voice quiet but steady. A fire that burns too bright does not last, she said, more to the room than to any one person. Thomas inclined his head slightly in agreement. He finished arranging the ash and rose to his feet, brushing his hands together once. Ethan remained kneeling for a moment longer, studying the hearth as if he might memorize it. Old Bear shifted with a low grunt, stretching his legs before settling again. His fur caught the firelight, highlighting the white around his muzzle. The dog was nearly 12 years old now, his movements slower each winter, but he still positioned himself so that one side of his body faced the warmth. Willow, the grey cat, stepped lightly across the floor and paused near the edge of the hearth, testing the heat with careful pause before curling into a tight circle. The fire responded to the ash covering by growing quieter, its light dimming slightly, but not disappearing. The heat did not vanish. Instead, it spread more evenly, seeping into the stones, the floor, the heavy logs of the cabin walls. The structure absorbed it willingly, holding it close the way it had been built to do. Sarah rose to her feet and moved to hang a small iron kettle farther from the flames, where it could remain warm without boiling. Even this small action reflected the same principle. Nothing wasted, nothing pushed too far. The fire was a companion through the night, not something to dominate. As the hour grew later, conversation faded entirely. Thomas guided Ethan back to the sleeping platform, tucking the blanket around him with a brief, firm motion. Ethan's eyes lingered on the hearth until his father nudged the edge of the blanket higher, blocking the view. The warmth remained, even without sight. The fire had been carried from one day to the next for as long as anyone in the cabin could remember. It was never fully extinguished during winter, only transformed. Flame to coal, coal to ember, ember back to flame. This continuity mattered. It meant that morning would not begin from nothing. It would begin from what had been preserved. Margaret closed her eyes at last, satisfied. Sarah settled beside Lily, her breathing slowing. Thomas checked the hearth one final time, then stepped back. The fire did not blaze. It endured, and in its quiet persistence, the cabin rested, prepared for the long night ahead. The cabin did not stand alone. It was joined, wall to the low structure at its rear, where the animals were kept through the winter. This adjoining space was not separate in spirit, only in function. Built of the same thick logs and roofed with the same heavy boards. The buyer shared the cabin's warmth and returned it in kind. Snow piled against its outer walls, just as it did against the cabin. But inside, the air moved slowly, softened by breath and time. The animals had already settled for the night. 3 cows stood shoulder to shoulder in their stalls, their large bodies steady and calm, steam rising faintly from their nostrils with each slow exhale. They were familiar creatures, accustomed to the routine of winter housing. Their hides were dark and glossy, their flanks broad, their movements unhurried. Nearby, several sheep lay curled in the straw, their thick wool matted and warm, eyes half-lidded as they chewed thoughtfully. A pair of goats shifted occasionally, lighter and more restless than the others, but quiet enough. This space carried a different sound than the cabin. Not silence, but a low, constant presence. The rhythm of breathing, the soft rustle of straw, the occasional stamp of a hoof. It was a sound that did not call attention to itself, yet filled the air completely. It was the sound of life, continuing without interruption. Ethan stood at the threshold, where the cabin opened into the byre, wrapped in his blanket, his breath fogging slightly in the cooler air near the door. He had been allowed to come back here, only after the fire had been banked and the night settled. Thomas stood a few steps behind him, close enough to guide, far enough to let Ethan feel independent. The boy moved carefully between the stalls, mindful of the animal's size. He approached the nearest cow, a large, patient animal with a white blaze on her forehead. She turned her head slightly, regarding him with calm, dark eyes. Ethan hesitated, then reached out slowly, placing his palm against her side. The warmth surprised him. It was not the sharp heat of the fire, but something deeper and steadier. The cow's body radiated warmth in a wide, even field, spreading through Ethan's fingers and into his arm. He held his hand there, feeling the gentle movement beneath the skin, the rise and fall of breath, the quiet work of a living body at rest. "She's warmer than the floor," Ethan said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Thomas nodded. "She never stops working," he replied, "even when she sleeps." Ethan thought about that. He imagined the fire and the cow sharing the same purpose, each giving what they could without effort or display. He left his hand there a moment longer, then stepped back, careful not to disturb her. Sarah watched from the doorway. The byre light cast her face in soft shadow, emphasizing the thoughtful calm she carried. She was tall and spare, her movements economical, shaped by years of managing a household where waste of time, energy, or resources could not be afforded. Seeing Ethan with the cow stirred a memory she had not revisited in some time. She remembered her own father, standing in a place much like this one, his hand resting on a horse's neck as he spoke quietly. He had been a patient man, not prone to speeches, but there were things he repeated each winter, as if they mattered more then. One of them returned to her now, clear as if he were standing beside her. "Animals are family in winter," he had said. "They keep us alive, and we keep them alive. That's the agreement." At the time, Sarah had nodded without fully understanding. Now, watching her son absorb the warmth of the cow without words, she understood completely. The animals were not tools or property in this season. They were participants. Their bodies produced heat, without asking anything in return beyond care and consistency. She stepped forward and rested her hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. He looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "They help keep the house warm," he said. "Yes," Sarah replied gently. "And we help them stay safe." They stood there together for a moment, listening. The warmth from the animals lingered, drifting through the open doorway into the cabin beyond. Even with the door partially closed, the air moved between the spaces, carrying heat and the faint, familiar scent of hay and animal hide. Old Bear had followed them back, though he remained near the threshold. The dog did not enter the byre fully anymore. His joints stiffened in the cold. Instead, he sat where the warmth overlapped, close enough to benefit without exertion. Willow appeared briefly at his side, peering into the dim space with alert curiosity, before retreating again to the cabin's deeper warmth. Thomas checked the latch on the byre door, ensuring it would hold through the night. He did not rush this task. A loose latch could mean cold drafts, or worse. Satisfied, he gestured for Ethan to return inside. As they moved back into the cabin, the contrast was subtle but noticeable. The cabin air felt warmer now, though the fire had not changed. The warmth from the animals had already begun to spread, rising and settling where the family would sleep. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes opening just enough to take in the room. She had always been attuned to these changes. Without comment, she adjusted her shawl and settled more comfortably, trusting the balance that had been established. Sarah closed the door between the spaces, sealing in the shared warmth. She paused with her hand on the wood, feeling the vibration of movement on the other side. The animals were quiet now, fully at rest. This exchange, human and animal, warmth given and received, was not discussed, not celebrated. It did not need to be. It was simply part of how the household endured winter. No single source of heat was enough on its own. The fire, the bodies, the walls, the animals, all contributed in small, steady ways. Ethan climbed back onto the sleeping platform, pulling his blanket close. His hand still carried the memory of warmth from the cow's side. It comforted him in a way he could not explain. Outside, the snow continued to fall, deepening the cold that pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the combined warmth of fire and living bodies held firm. Sarah glanced once more toward the back of the cabin, then joined her children. She did not speak her father's words aloud. She did not need to. The lesson was already present, alive in the air around them. The animals breathed steadily. The warmth moved quietly, and the night accepted this balance without resistance. The sound of the door opening cut gently through the quiet of the cabin, not sharply, not with urgency, but with the familiar weight of effort against cold wood. A breath of winter air slipped inside, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine. Then the door closed again, firmly, sealing the warmth back in. Thomas entered first. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat, melting slowly into dark patches on his coat. His posture was heavy with fatigue, but not bowed. He moved with the deliberate calm of a man who had measured his limits and accepted them without resentment. Behind him came Jacob. Jacob Miller was 17, tall for his age, his frame still narrowing into adulthood. His face held sharp lines softened by youth, dark hair damp with melted snow curling at the edges. He carried his rifle low, not slung proudly as he had on past hunts, but resting against his side as if it had grown heavier on the return. This was the first winter he had hunted as a man rather than a boy, and the first time he had come back with nothing to show for it. A third figure followed, Samuel, Thomas's younger brother. Samuel was shorter, broader in the shoulders, his beard already streaked with grey despite being younger than Thomas. He had always been quieter, more reserved, a man who spoke little and observed much. He closed the door carefully behind them, knocking snow from his boots before stepping fully inside. No one asked questions. Sarah rose without a word, taking Thomas's coat and hanging it on the peg near the door. The fabric was stiff with cold, water dripping slowly onto the packed earth floor. She did the same for Jacob and Samuel, moving efficiently, without pause. Lily watched from her place on the sleeping platform, her eyes curious but calm. Ethan stirred, lifting his head just long enough to see who had come in, then settled again. Jacob stood still for a moment, unsure where to put his hands. His fingers were red from the cold, stiff despite the gloves he had worn. He felt the familiar warmth of the cabin wrap around him, and with it came the weight of disappointment he had been holding back all the way home. He had tracked carefully. He had waited patiently. He had done everything as he had been taught. And still, the forest had given nothing. He expected something. A question, a sigh, perhaps even a look that lingered too long. Instead, Margaret's voice drifted from near the hearth, steady and unremarkable. "You'll warm up," she said, as if that were the only thing that mattered. Jacob exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He moved toward the fire, extending his hands toward the heat. The low flames reflected in his eyes, and for the first time since leaving the woods, his shoulders eased. Thomas said nothing as he checked the latch on the door, ensuring it was tight. He had known before they returned that the hunt had failed. The signs were there. The absence of weight, the pace of their steps. But failure in winter did not carry the same meaning it might in another season. It was not a verdict. It was information. Samuel set his rifle against the wall and sat on the bench, rubbing his hands together slowly. His face showed weariness, but no frustration. He glanced once at Jacob, then back to the fire, as if silently acknowledging the younger man's effort without drawing attention to it. Sarah brought a small bowl of warm broth from near the hearth and handed it first to Thomas, then to Jacob. The liquid was thin, not meant to satisfy hunger, only to restore warmth and steadiness. Jacob accepted it gratefully, the steam rising toward his face. "You did what you could," Sarah said quietly, her voice even, free of consolation or judgment. Jacob nodded. He did not trust himself to speak yet. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, as if responding to the return of movement inside. Snow tapped softly against the roof, relentless but patient. Inside, the fire maintained its low glow, unchanged by the men's arrival or the outcome of their hunt. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "Tracks were there," he said, not as an explanation, but as a simple statement of fact. "They turned," Jacob added after a moment. "We followed until the light went." Thomas inclined his head. "That happens." There was no more to say, no advice offered, no correction given. The lesson was not in words tonight. Jacob finished the broth and set the bowl aside. He removed his gloves, flexing his fingers slowly as sensation returned. The sting of warmth replaced the numbness of cold. He glanced around the cabin. The animals breathing beyond the wall. The fire steady. His family settled and whole. The hunt had failed, but nothing else had fallen apart. Margaret watched him over the rim of her cup. She remembered her own first winter failures, though they belonged to a different kind of work. The memory brought no bitterness, only understanding. Survival, she knew, was not a straight line of success. Samuel rose to hang his own coat, then returned to his seat without comment. Old Bear lifted his head briefly, acknowledging the men's return with a soft thump of his tail against the floor, before settling again. Willow appeared from the shadows, weaving briefly between Jacob's boots before disappearing once more. Jacob took his place on the sleeping platform near Ethan. The younger boy shifted instinctively closer, sharing warmth without waking fully. Jacob rested his hand lightly on the blanket between them, grounding himself in the simple fact of presence. Outside, the forest remained indifferent. Inside, no one spoke of tomorrow's hunt or the next attempt. Tonight was not for planning. Tonight was for rest. The men had returned with empty hands, but they had returned together, and that was enough. The pot had been warm for hours, resting near the edge of the hearth, where the heat was steady but gentle. It did not boil or hiss. It simply waited. When Sarah finally lifted the lid, a quiet breath of steam rose into the room, carrying the familiar scent of barley, roots, and the last preserved bits of meat from autumn. It was not a rich smell, not one that promised abundance, but it was honest. It promised warmth. Sarah Miller moved with practiced calm as she prepared the meal. She was tall and lean, her shoulders slightly rounded, not from weakness but from years of bending into work, lifting, mending, carrying, tending. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, streaked with early grey that she did not bother to hide. There was a steadiness to her presence that shaped the household more than rules ever could. Sarah was not a woman who raised her voice. Hard winters in her childhood had taught her that calm lasted longer than force, and that fear, once introduced, was difficult to remove. She ladled the stew into simple wooden bowls, careful to keep the portions even. No bowl was filled to the brim. That was not how winter meals were meant to be eaten. They were meant to be warm, slow, and sustaining, not heavy. She placed the bowls on the low table near the fire, one by one, the steam rising steadily into the dim light. The family gathered without instruction. Thomas sat first, then Margaret, then the others in a natural order that required no discussion. Jacob took his place quietly, still carrying the tired weight of the day, but steadier now. Ethan climbed down from the platform, rubbing his eyes, and Lily followed, her step small and careful as she carried a folded piece of bread in both hands. The bread was dense and dark, baked days earlier and kept wrapped in cloth. Lily was small for her age, narrow-shouldered, with hair that never seemed to stay neatly braided. She had a quiet attentiveness about her, a habit of watching before acting. Tonight, as she sat beside Margaret, she paused. She looked down at her own portion of bread, then at the old woman's bowl. Without a word, Lily broke her bread in half and slid one piece toward Margaret. Margaret looked down at the offering, then up at Lily. Her face, deeply lined by years and weather, softened into something close to a smile. She did not speak immediately. She simply placed her hand briefly over Lily's small fingers. A gesture, light but deliberate. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice calm and clear. Lily nodded, satisfied, and returned her attention to her bowl. Sarah noticed the exchange from across the table. She did not comment on it. She did not need to. Something in her chest loosened slightly. A quiet recognition. She had spent many years worrying about having enough. Enough food, enough wood, enough strength to carry the family through winter. Watching Lily share without hesitation, she felt a different understanding settle in. Enough did not always mean full. The meal began slowly. No one hurried. Spoons moved through the stew at an unhurried pace, lifting warm liquid and soft grains. The heat of the food spread outward, warming hands first, then faces, then deeper places inside the body. It was a warmth that lasted longer than fire alone could provide. Old Bear lay near the hearth, his nose resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Occasionally, he lifted his head as a spoon scraped softly against a bowl, then settled again. Willow appeared briefly near the table, assessing the situation with bright eyes before retreating, uninterested in what was offered. Samuel ate quietly, his posture relaxed now that the work of the day was done, his broad hands wrapped around the bowl, absorbing the heat. Across from him, Jacob ate with careful focus. He did not speak much, but the tension in his shoulders eased with each mouthful. The disappointment of the hunt did not vanish, but it softened, becoming something manageable. Margaret ate slowly, as she always did. Age had changed her appetite, but not her appreciation. She savored the warmth more than the taste, closing her eyes briefly between bites. The stew reminded her of countless meals before this one, each eaten in similar conditions, each serving the same purpose. It was not luxury that carried people through winter. It was consistency. Sarah sat last, as she often did, watching as much as eating. She noticed how no one reached for more before finishing what they had, how no one complained, how the room felt fuller with warmth than it had before the bowls were filled. She realized, with a quiet clarity, that the word enough had changed meaning for her over the years. In her younger days, enough had meant security against fear. Now, it meant balance. The fire flickered slightly as a small piece of wood shifted, but it remained low and controlled. The warmth from the animals behind the wall continued to seep gently into the space. Outside, the snow pressed on, indifferent to the meal taking place within. When the bowls were empty, they were set aside without ceremony. No one rushed to stand. The warmth from the food lingered, spreading slowly through tired limbs. This was why the meal mattered. Not because it filled stomachs completely, but because it prepared bodies for rest. Sarah leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap. She looked around the table, at Thomas's quiet strength, at Jacob's steady breathing, at Ethan leaning against his brother, at Lily curled close to Margaret. She felt no triumph, no sense of victory over winter, only readiness. Tonight, the family was fed. Tonight, the warmth was shared. And tonight, that was enough. The cabin changed character once the meal was finished. The air grew heavier, not with smoke or cold, but with the quiet weight of bodies preparing to rest. Movement slowed. Voices softened. The fire remained low, its glow steady. No longer a center of activity, but a background presence, like a heartbeat that no one consciously followed, yet everyone depended on. There were no separate rooms in the cabin, no doors to close between one sleeper and another. Privacy, in this season, was neither expected nor desired. Warmth mattered more than space. The sleeping platforms along the walls had been prepared earlier in the day, layered carefully with straw, old wool blankets, and animal skins. These layers were not luxurious, but they were deliberate. Each one trapped air. Each one held heat. Sarah rose first to begin the quiet work of arranging the night. She moved with the same steady grace she carried into every task. Her tall, lean frame bent easily as she straightened the bedding, pulling edges into place, smoothing folds not for appearance but for function. Years ago, during a winter when illness had taken 2 members of her childhood household, she had learned the importance of careful preparation before sleep. Cold crept in most easily when people were tired. Since then, she never rushed this moment. Thomas stood nearby, lifting the youngest blankets and placing them closer to the fireside of the platform. He did not speak, but his choices were precise. The warmest positions went where they always did. Margaret's place was nearest the hearth, close enough to receive its radiant heat throughout the night. Age had thinned her body and slowed her circulation, but the family compensated without discussion. Margaret lowered herself carefully onto the platform, her movements slow but practiced. Her hair, once dark, was now completely silver, worn long and braided loosely over one shoulder. Her face bore the marks of a long life spent outdoors and indoors in equal measure, shaped by weather, work, and observation. She settled into the bedding with a small sigh, the sound of someone who trusted the place she lay. Lily climbed up next. Moving with quiet focus, she curled beside her grandmother instinctively, her smaller body fitting easily into the warm space beside Margaret's larger frame. Lily's presence was gentle. She did not fidget or complain. She simply adjusted her blanket, then reached out to touch Margaret's sleeve, reassured by contact. Ethan followed, guided lightly by Thomas's hand. He lay on the other side of his father, close enough that their shoulders touched. Ethan was still young enough to find comfort in this closeness, though he did not speak of it. He pulled the blanket up under his chin and lay still, his body already heavy with sleep. Jacob took his place at the far edge of the platform. As the youngest adult, his position was slightly cooler, more exposed. His taller, stronger body would lose heat more easily to the surrounding air, but it would also shield the others. This arrangement had been shaped over years, refined without words. Jacob accepted it without thought. His long limbs folded carefully as he settled, his back to the outer wall. Samuel chose the opposite platform, along with Thomas. The two men lay parallel to the others, mirroring the arrangement across the room. Old Bear positioned himself at the foot of Thomas's side, his aging body angled to absorb warmth from both fire and people. Willow appeared briefly, stepping lightly across the bedding before choosing a hollow near Lily's knees, where warmth gathered naturally. The fire was banked lower now, its flames reduced to a soft glow. The stones around the hearth still held heat, radiating it outward in slow waves. The animals beyond the wall breathed steadily, their warmth continuing to move invisibly through the cabin. Ethan lay on his side, facing his father's back. In the quiet, he became aware of Thomas's breathing. It was deep and even, a slow rise and fall that carried through the bedding. Ethan found himself matching it without thinking, his own breath gradually slowing to the same rhythm. Each inhale felt easier than the last. He listened, not for danger, not for sound, but for presence. Margaret shifted slightly, adjusting her blanket. After a moment, her voice emerged from the darkness, barely above a whisper. It was not a formal story, not one with a beginning or an ending. It was more like a memory, drifting into words. "There was a winter," she murmured, "when the snow didn't stop for weeks." Her voice trailed off, then resumed, uneven, as if she were not certain which parts mattered. She spoke of a river, frozen so thick it held wagons, of a night when the fire nearly failed, of people sitting closer than they thought possible. The details were incomplete, the story fragmentary. But that did not matter. No one needed it to make sense. Her words moved through the room like another layer of warmth, settling gently over the sleepers. Lily's breathing deepened. Ethan's eyes closed fully. Even Jacob, still awake at the edge, felt the tension of the day loosen its grip. Margaret's voice faded gradually, thinning until it stopped altogether. The story was unfinished, but it had served its purpose. Silence followed, comfortable and unbroken. The night pressed in from outside. Snow continued to fall, piling against the cabin walls. The cold did not retreat. It waited. Inside, bodies lay close. Heat moved from skin to skin, from breath to breath. The absence of distance became a quiet form of protection. No one lay alone. No one needed to. The fire dimmed to embers. The room darkened. Breathing synchronized, slowed, deepened, and the night accepted them as they were. Together, resting, alive. The night reached its deepest point without announcement. There was no sudden shift, no clear boundary marking its arrival. It came quietly, settling layer by layer, as the fire reduced itself to a bed of glowing embers, and the cabin surrendered fully to darkness. Outside, the snow continued its steady descent, thickening the silence of the forest. Inside, The world narrowed to breath, warmth, and the faintest sounds of life continuing. The light was nearly gone now. Only the dull red glow of the embers remained, barely strong enough to outline the stones of the hearth. Shadows softened and blended until shapes lost their edges. The cabin no longer felt like a room, but like a single shared space, held together by bodies lying close, and the slow circulation of heat. No one slept alone. Thomas lay on his side, facing inward, his back shielding Ethan from the cooler air near the wall. His breathing remained deep and measured, unchanged by the hour. Years of winter nights had trained his body to rest without tension, conserving energy, releasing nothing unnecessary. Even asleep, his presence was steady, anchoring the space around him. Ethan slept close, his forehead resting lightly against the back of Thomas's shoulder. Earlier, he had listened to his father's breathing with intention. Now, his own breath followed the same rhythm without effort. The warmth around him felt complete, enclosing him on all sides. Father behind him, Jacob's legs nearby, the blankets above, the shared heat beneath. The cold no longer felt like something to resist. It existed somewhere beyond the edges of his awareness. Across the platform, Lily slept deeply. Her small body was curled instinctively toward Margaret, their forms fitting together naturally. Lily's face was relaxed, her brow smooth, her hands tucked beneath her chin. In sleep, she drifted into a dream she did not question. In the dream, winter loosened its grip. She stood barefoot on damp earth, the ground soft beneath her feet. Snow melted into clear water that ran between her toes. The trees, bare moments before, now carried pale green buds. Light filtered through branches that no longer creaked under weight. She could hear birds, not the distant, rare calls of winter, but many voices at once, overlapping and alive. The air was warm, not hot, and it smelled of soil and new growth. Lily did not run. She simply stood there, certain that spring would come without being chased. Margaret slept lightly, as she always did. Age had altered her rest, making it shallower, but not restless. She woke briefly during the night, her eyes opening to darkness. She listened. Breathing filled the cabin, layered and uneven, yet somehow unified. The animals in the byre shifted occasionally, their warmth continuing to seep through the shared wall. Satisfied, Margaret closed her eyes again, trusting what she felt more than what she could see. Jacob lay awake longer than the others. He had expected the cold to find him here, at the edge of the platform where the wall met the night. In past winters, this was where the chill crept in first, testing resolve and patience. But as the hours passed, Jacob noticed something unexpected. He was not cold. At first, he thought it was the lingering warmth of the meal. Then he thought it might be the fire, though its glow had faded further. Slowly, he became aware of the truth. Heat moved toward him from multiple directions. Ethan's small body radiated warmth, pressed close without realizing it. Thomas's back formed a barrier, blocking drafts. The shared bedding trapped heat beneath and above. Even the wall behind him felt less cold than it had earlier, warmed gradually by the cabin's interior. Jacob exhaled slowly. The disappointment he had carried since returning from the hunt loosened its hold. He realized that the failure still existed, but it no longer defined the night. He did not need to prove anything here. His role at this moment was simply to be present, to lend his warmth to the collective, just as others lent theirs to him. Old Bear shifted with a quiet sigh, adjusting his position closer to Thomas's legs. His breathing was audible now, a low, steady sound that blended with the human rhythm. Willow stirred briefly, lifting her head before tucking it again beneath Lily's blanket edge, where warmth pooled naturally. The cabin held this arrangement without effort. Heat circulated slowly, invisibly, sustained by bodies that asked nothing of one another. There were no words spoken. None were needed. Outside, the cold pressed on relentlessly. The night showed no mercy, no intention of easing. But inside, the conditions for survival had already been met. The fire still lived beneath ash. The animals continued to breathe. The walls held what warmth they could. And most importantly, no one faced the darkness alone. Jacob's eyes finally closed. His last waking thought was simple and unremarkable. He was warm, and that was enough. The night deepened further, passing its coldest hour without incident. Breath continued. Heat remained shared. Dreams unfolded quietly, and the cabin endured. The coldest hour of the night did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, as winter always did, slipping into the spaces left unguarded. Outside the cabin, the temperature fell another degree, tightening the air until it felt brittle. Snow lay heavy against the walls, unmoving, patient. The forest held its breath. Inside, the cabin remained still. The fire was no longer flame, but memory. Embers buried beneath ash, glowing faintly, alive enough to wait. The animals beyond the wall shifted once, then settled again. Breath continued to rise and fall, layered and uneven, yet connected. Winter had not been defeated. It had simply been met correctly. Thomas drifted in and out of sleep, his body resting while his mind wandered through earlier winters. He did not dream in images so much as sensations. The ache of cold fingers learning patience, the weight of responsibility settling onto younger shoulders long before they felt ready. He remembered nights far colder than this one, in cabins less sturdy, with fewer hands to share the work. One winter returned to him clearly. He had been barely older than Jacob was now. The hunt had failed 3 days in a row. The firewood pile had dwindled faster than expected. Fear had moved through the household like a draft, unseen but sharp. What had saved them was not a sudden success or an act of strength. It had been routine. Getting up, checking the fire, sharing what little they had, staying close. That winter had taught him something he carried still. Nature does not respond to force. It responds to understanding. Thomas shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Ethan. The boy slept deeply now, his small body heavy with warmth. Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle over him. Jacob would learn this lesson too in time. Failure was not weakness. Panic was. Across the platform, Sarah lay awake, She had not slept deeply since her children were born. Motherhood had altered her rest, sharpening her awareness, even in stillness. She listened now, not for danger, but for balance. Breathing, silence, the soft creak of the cabin adjusting to cold. Her thoughts moved inward, tracing the path that had brought her here. She had grown up believing strength meant endurance, meant pushing through pain without complaint. She had learned early how to lift heavy loads, how to work until exhaustion felt ordinary. For years, she had equated survival with effort. But winter had changed that understanding. Watching this household, watching herself, she realized strength lived elsewhere. It lived in preparation, done long before fear arrived, in habits repeated even when tired, in the ability to slow down instead of rush forward blindly. Muscles mattered, yes, but they were not enough. Strength lived in knowing when to conserve. She thought of Lily, sharing her bread without hesitation, of Jacob returning empty-handed, yet unashamed, of Thomas banking the fire instead of feeding it more. None of these actions required force. All of them required restraint. Sarah's breath slowed as the realization settled fully. Winter did not reward those who fought it hardest. It favored those who respected its rules. Margaret stirred, waking briefly, as she often did during the deepest part of night. She sensed the change in temperature immediately. Her bones knew this hour well. She adjusted her shawl slightly, then relaxed again, confident in the system surrounding her. This was not her first coldest hour, nor would it be her last. She had lived long enough to know that winter was not an enemy to conquer. It was a passage, one that demanded cooperation rather than resistance. Jacob slept now, his earlier wakefulness gone. His body had accepted the warmth offered, had stopped searching for threat. His failure on the hunt no longer weighed on him in sleep. Instead, his presence contributed to the collective heat, his strength serving quietly, without recognition. Lily's dream shifted gently, spring giving way to a moment of drifting warmth and light without form. Her body remained curled, safe, unaware of the lesson unfolding around her, yet already learning it through experience rather than explanation. The night pressed on, unyielding but contained. Winter did not soften. It did not retreat, but it was endured. The lesson was not spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It lived in the arrangement of bodies, in the way heat was shared, in the quiet confidence that morning would come, because the right things had been done at the right time. The coldest hour passed. The cabin held. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came in stages so subtle, they were easy to miss if one did not know to look for them. The darkness thinned first, loosening its hold on the corners of the cabin. Then the air itself seemed to change. Less brittle, slightly more willing to move. Outside, the snow still lay deep, but the sky above it had begun to pale, shifting from black to a quiet, uncertain grey. Inside the cabin, the embers were still alive. They glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash, no longer bright enough to light the room, but warm enough to remember what they were. The stones of the hearth held on to that memory, radiating a gentle heat into the space where bodies lay close together. Breath continued to rise and fall, slow and heavy, the sound of sleep shared. Ethan woke before anyone else. He did not know why. There was no noise to wake him, no sudden thought or dream. He simply opened his eyes and lay still for a moment, aware of the quiet. The first thing he noticed was warmth. His blanket was still pulled close, his back pressed lightly against his father, his feet tucked near Jacob's legs. The night had not taken anything from him. Carefully, so carefully that even old Bear did not stir, Ethan slid free of the bedding. His movements were slow and deliberate, guided by instinct rather than instruction. He remembered what Thomas had shown him the evening before. He remembered the ash, the embers beneath it, the way fire waited if treated correctly. The floor was cold beneath his feet, but not painfully so. He crossed the short distance to the hearth and knelt, brushing ash aside with a small stick. A dull red glow answered him immediately. Ethan's chest lifted with quiet relief. "They're still there," he whispered, though no one had asked. He added a few thin pieces of kindling, just enough to invite air back into the embers. He waited. Smoke curled upward first. Then a small flame appeared. Tentative, but real. Ethan did not rush. He remembered that too. Behind him, Thomas stirred. He opened his eyes just enough to see the change in the light. The faint flicker at the hearth told him everything he needed to know. He watched Ethan for a moment without moving, pride settling in quietly. This was not something that required praise. It was something that required trust. Thomas rose and joined him, adding a thicker piece of wood once the flame had taken hold. Together, they built the fire back into itself. Not high, not dramatic, but alive. Sarah woke next. She sat up slowly, stretching stiffness from her shoulders. Her body felt heavy, but intact. The night had been long, but it had passed without incident. She took in the scene at a glance. The fire returning, Ethan kneeling beside it, Thomas steady at his side, and allowed herself a small breath of relief. Jacob followed, blinking against the returning light. He felt tired in a deep, satisfying way. His body had rested fully for the first time since before the hunt. He swung his legs over the edge of the platform and stood, flexing his hands as warmth returned to them. Margaret was already awake, watching from her place near the hearth. She had not moved, but her eyes were bright. A faint smile touched her lips as she observed Ethan tending the fire. It was not a proud smile or a sentimental one. It was the expression of someone who recognized continuity. She knew, without being told, that the family had made it through another night. Lily stirred last, curling deeper into her blanket before finally sitting up. She looked around, momentarily disoriented, then relaxed as she recognized the familiar shapes and sounds. Willow stretched and slipped from the bedding, tail flicking as she moved closer to the fire. Old Bear lifted his head, tail thumping once against the floor. The cabin filled slowly with quiet morning sounds. The crackle of growing flame, the soft scrape of boots on packed earth, the low murmur of movement. Outside, the snow reflected the new light, brightening the world without warming it yet. The animals in the byre responded as well. A cow shifted her weight, exhaling deeply. Hooves scraped against straw. The shared warmth of night had carried them too. Sarah moved to prepare the morning tasks. Her motions unhurried. She did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. There was work to be done, always. But none of it felt urgent in the way it had during the night. Morning allowed for planning. Night demanded endurance. Margaret accepted a cup of warm water and wrapped her hands around it. She looked from face to face. Thomas, Sarah, the children, and nodded once, satisfied. Another one, she said simply. No one replied. They did not need to. Outside, the day waited. Inside, the fire burned again. They were tired. They were cold, but they were safe. And that was enough to begin. The days that followed did not bring sudden change. Snow continued to fall in measured intervals, sometimes thick and heavy, sometimes light enough to drift without sound. The cold remained steady, pressing against the cabin walls with the same patience it always had. Winter did not loosen its grip simply because one night had been endured, but something else had settled in its place. Confidence stayed. Morning routines repeated themselves with quiet consistency. The fire was coaxed back to life each dawn, never forced, never neglected. Water was warmed. Boots were dried and mended. Food was prepared with the same careful balance as before. Each task followed another, in a rhythm that required no discussion. The cabin had found its pace, and within that pace, the family moved without friction. Jacob took to the forest again after several days of rest. This time, he did not rush. He moved differently now, his tall frame less rigid, his steps more deliberate. Jacob had always been strong, his muscles shaped early by work and long walks through uneven terrain. But strength alone had failed him on his last hunt. The lesson had settled quietly. During the night he spent at the edge of the sleeping platform, warmed by others. Now, he carried it with him into the woods. He watched more, listened longer. Instead of pushing deep into unfamiliar territory, he studied the edges, the places where animals moved not out of fear, but habit. He learned to read the snow not for distance traveled, but for intention, which tracks wandered, which moved with purpose. He adjusted his timing, setting out later when the light was clearer, returning earlier before fatigue dulled his judgment. Thomas accompanied him once, not to instruct, but to observe. He noticed the change immediately and said nothing. Approval, in this household, was often silent. Back at the cabin, Sarah continued her steady work. She did not measure success by how much was accomplished in a day, but by how little was wasted. A tall, lean figure moved through the space with familiarity, her hands sure, her posture relaxed. The years had taught her to preserve energy for what mattered most. She checked stores, repaired clothing, and maintained routines that would carry them forward, regardless of what the weather decided. There were moments when fatigue brushed close, when the endless white outside pressed against her thoughts. In those moments, she remembered the night they had all slept through together, the fire banked properly, the animals breathing warmth through the wall, the children safe. That memory did not erase difficulty, but it made it manageable. Margaret spent more time awake during the days now, sitting near the window where pale light filtered through the snow. She spoke little, but her presence anchored the household. When she did speak, it was often to remind the others of something easily overlooked. How weather moved in cycles. How winters came and went, regardless of human worry. Her smile appeared more often, brief and knowing. Lily found her own way of preparing for what came next. She discovered a small wooden box near the back of the cabin, its corners worn smooth from age. Inside, she placed a handful of soil gathered from beneath the snow, where the earth remained softer. She pressed several dried seeds into it, beans saved from the last harvest, and covered them carefully. Each morning, she checked the box, touching the soil lightly, as if listening. She did not ask when spring would come. She simply assumed it would. Ethan watched her with quiet curiosity, sometimes helping, sometimes just observing. To him, the box became a promise he could see and touch, something waiting, not rushing. The idea comforted him. The animals continued their steady contribution. The cow's breath rose in the cold air, their warmth constant. Sheep shifted and settled. The cycle repeated without interruption. Old Bear grew slower, sleeping more deeply, but his presence remained reassuring. Willow claimed new warm spots each day, adapting without complaint. Outside, the forest endured winter, as it always had. Inside, the cabin held. Jacob returned one afternoon with his first successful catch of the season. It was modest, not cause for celebration, but enough. He carried it quietly, his movements careful, his expression calm. When he entered the cabin, no one cheered. Sarah nodded. Thomas met his eyes briefly. Margaret closed her eyes in satisfaction. That night, the meal was a little fuller, but no one ate faster than usual. Winter continued, but it no longer felt endless. Each day passed into the next, marked not by dramatic change, but by accumulation. Knowledge gained, habits reinforced, trust deepened. Lily's seeds did not sprout yet, but she watered them anyway. Snow still fell, cold still came, but belief had taken root. And slowly, almost without being noticed, winter began to move on. Spring did not arrive as a sudden event. It came the way winter had. Quietly, patiently, without ceremony. The snow thinned first, retreating from the edges of the forest floor and breaking into shallow streams that traced familiar paths downhill. The air softened. Light lingered longer on the cabin walls. The cold loosened its grip, not because it was defeated, but because its season had passed. The cabin still stood. Its logs, darkened by months of smoke and weather, remained solid. The roof held. The walls bore the marks of winter without complaint. Inside, the hearth carried the same stones, the same ash, the same quiet memory of nights endured. Nothing about the cabin suggested triumph. It suggested continuity. Sarah stepped outside one morning and paused, feeling the change immediately. The ground beneath her boots was damp rather than frozen. She stood tall and still, her slender frame outlined by pale sunlight, filtering through bare branches now tipped with green earth. Sarah had always been a woman shaped by endurance rather than optimism, but this moment did not require hope. It required recognition. They had made it through. Thomas followed, carrying a bundle of wood that was lighter than the ones he had hauled all winter. His broad shoulders relaxed as he set it down. He scanned the clearing. noting where snow had receded and where mud would soon replace it. His expression was calm, thoughtful. Winter had not broken him. It had instructed him, as it always did. Jacob emerged next, his movements confident without being hurried. The season had changed him subtly. His strength remained, but it was now paired with restraint. He had learned to read more than tracks, to read himself. Failure no longer lingered on him like weight. It had become a lesson absorbed, then set aside. Ethan and Lily stepped out together, blinking at the brightness. Ethan stretched his arms wide, breathing in the cool, clean air. Lily knelt immediately near her wooden box, brushing away the last clinging snow. She gasped softly as she saw it. Green. Small, fragile shoots had pushed their way up through the soil. Lily stared at them, as if they might disappear if she looked too long. She touched one gently, her fingers careful, reverent. They came, she whispered. Margaret watched from the doorway, leaning lightly on her cane. Her white hair caught the sunlight, glowing softly. She smiled. Not broadly, but deeply. She had seen many springs, and she knew better than to celebrate their arrival as victory. But this one carried meaning. Everyone was here. Old Bear shuffled out slowly, his movements stiff, but determined. He lowered himself into a patch of sun and closed his eyes, absorbing warmth with the contentment of a creature who had done his work well. Willow followed, sleek and alert, already exploring new scents carried by the changing air. The family gathered near the hearth one last time that evening, not because they needed the warmth now, but because the habit remained. The fire burned low, as it always had. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to explain. They had not conquered winter. They had not mastered nature. They had stayed. They had kept the fire alive, sometimes barely, sometimes confidently, but always together. They had shared warmth, space, effort, and presence. No one had been left alone. No one had been asked to endure more than they could carry. As the light faded gently into evening, Sarah felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Strength, she now knew, was not measured by how much one could withstand alone. It was measured by how well one stayed connected when isolation offered itself as an easier path. The fire dimmed. The cabin breathed. The season turned. And somewhere beyond this place, beyond this time, the lesson remained. Soft, steady, waiting to be remembered. In the winters of your own life, you do not need to win. You do not need to fight harder than the cold. You only need to keep the fire. Stay close and not abandon yourself. That has always been enough. As this story comes to rest, its lesson does not ask you to be stronger than your circumstances. It asks you to be gentler with them. The family you have followed did not survive winter by defeating the cold, working harder than everyone else, or pretending fear did not exist. They survived by preparing early, by keeping small routines steady, and by staying close when distance would have made everything harder. In the harshest conditions, they did not look for dramatic solutions. They looked for warmth that could be shared, habits that could be repeated, and people who would not leave. In everyday life, our winters rarely look like snow and fire. They arrive as exhaustion, loneliness, financial pressure, grief, or long periods of uncertainty. And just like in the story, these seasons are not meant to be conquered all at once. They are meant to be moved through slowly, one day at a time, one small act at a time. Keeping your own fire might mean protecting a simple routine, reaching out to someone you trust, resting instead of pushing, or allowing yourself to admit that you are tired. After listening, consider one small action you can take today. Something gentle and realistic. Something that keeps warmth in your life rather than demanding more strength from you. And if this story brought you comfort, consider sharing it with someone who may be walking through a cold season of their own. If you feel moved, let us know in the comments where you are listening from and what helps you keep going during difficult times. If this story helped you rest, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. And if you believe in prayer, may God bless and protect everyone listening tonight. May peace stay near you. May strength arrive quietly. And may you never feel alone. If this message resonates with you, write Amen in the comments.